Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. We've got a pretty good algae bloom going on the river right now. A lot of our local lakes are experiencing one, which is kind of a little late in the season, but not uncommon. One thing that happens a lot of times is you have a lot less rainfall, you've got warm temperatures still, and when that happens and you've got stagnant water, that can lead to a lot of algae growth. And that can lead to some potentially difficult fishing. One thing that happens quite a bit is you start getting a lot of that filament that's growing on the surface or in the surface couple layers of water. And what that means is you almost have some sunlight blockage. And if you have a little bit of sunlight blockage, what that tends to do is allow the fish to roam further from some tighter pieces of cover. It allows them to get out and move around, and it just generally plays around with the water as a whole. So it can lead to some pretty difficult fishing. I think one thing that a lot of times will happen is you'll find that your deeper bite tends to not be as good as the shallow bite. And I don't know if that's because your deeper fish will actually move up shallower just based on less light penetration, or if that means they just feel more comfortable in that shallow water, or those fish are more accessible to the angler. Really haven't figured that part out, but what I do know is there are some very specific baits that I like to throw during a LJ bloom that will increase the number of bites that I get. Now, one thing to also note, depending on how thick the bloom is, you may have very, very thick filamentation on the surface, and you'll also have pretty good filamentation that occurs on the bottom when you're in a heavy LJ bloom. So that can mean that your topwater baits may not function properly. They may get gunked up with some of the filament. It also means that your bottom baits could be really gunked up as well because a lot of that filament will sink to the bottom. You'll get some of that black kind of decaying algae growth, whatever it is, and that can cause some of your dragging baits on the bottom to be gunked up as well. So because of that, I tend to find myself wanting to fish a lot of baits that are kind of right below the surface or more so below the surface of the LJ bloom itself. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is if you're in relatively calm conditions or fishing in areas that have current, a lot of times what you'll find is that LJ is grouped up in the surface level of the fishery, or at least that's where you'll have your thicker growths or your thicker areas of it. And it's not really been all mixed in with the rest of the water. If you happen to be on a river, like what'll happen on the river here is you'll have LJ that's throughout the entire system, but where you have your stronger current, you'll actually have more fresh water pulling through those areas, which leads to not necessarily less algae, but what it does is it mixes the LJ up and you have more water with less algae, if that makes sense. But you also have areas where the current will create eddies, and in those eddies, you'll have very, very thick algae sedimentation. So it changes what you can fish. If you happen to be, say, on a main river area that has more water flow through it, it's a lot cleaner generally to fish. But if some of the eddies along that same area could be super thick in algae that you can't even work baits through it. As soon as your bait hits the water, it'll get all gunked up and you can't fish it. So it's important to recognize that just because a body of water is having an algae bloom does not necessarily mean that it's the same throughout the entire lake. And if you have relatively stable conditions with not much wind, what you'll find is that that algae bloom is generally closer to the surface. So you can actually get below it and get into some cleaner water. So for me, I like to fish my baits right below that algae bloom if I can and run a baits below it. It would be similar to working right below or right above certain types of weed growth. If you can get a bait that runs right across the top, only it's inverted where you're running right below it. The point here is I tend to think that that's a really good place to fish. It's similar to fishing like a mud line. A lot of times your mud lines are at a certain depth and then it turns to clean water. Well, if you can run your bait right where that clean water meets the mud line or meets the algae bloom, you're going to find that that's a really good strike zone. It creates a good ambush location for the bass. So I like to fish algae blooms very much like a mud line. So some of my favorite baits, probably my go-to favorite bait, is a spinner bait, something like this Picasso titanium. This thing is just a great bait for triggering strikes when you have that mixing of water. Just like I said with a mudline, spinner bait's great with that. Same thing with an algae bloom. And I also find that a lot of times your fish, I just feel like the fish tend to be more aggressive in shallower water when you find this. It's like that algae bloom is creating cover and the fish are trying to take advantage of it. I can tell you on a lot of lakes up here in the North Country, you can catch some of the biggest smallmouth in your lake in less than 4 or 5 foot of water, burning a spinnerbait right under the algae blooms, where most people would say, I don't want to fish that. But a spinnerbait is an absolute must bait for me to be using during those circumstances. I also really like throwing your vibrating jigs like the Berkeley Slobber Knocker here with the power stinger on the back. Again, very similar in terms of your spinner bait, where you're trying to mimic a bait fish that is just running right at that mixing of water, and that just creates a really good opportunity for bass to take advantage of it. The other thing with both those baits, they tend to run really well still through that sedimentation. So, one issue I'd have, say, throwing a buzz bait. If somebody wanted to throw a buzz bait, a lot of times that buzz bait will get gunked up with that algae bloom. Uh, and the same thing can be said for fishing, some sort of like a Texas rig or something along those lines. A lot of times you'll just get that sediment that grabs the line and you can't really shake it. Well, with a moving bait where you're ripping it and generally imparting a lot of rod movement, you can clean that bait off from some of the algae sometimes. Now, if I'm fishing the bottom and I've still got a relatively clean bottom, uh, I like to really throw a money badger or a shallower running crankbait, something that's going to run, I'll say down to that 10-foot depth, because again, a lot of that algae is going to be in 3 foot of water or less to the surface. So you may be fishing 10 feet of water, but the top 3 feet is where you have a lot of that sedimentation. You need to get a bait that runs down below that. Now, one reason I really like the money badger is for what I just said about being able to clean the bait. This is a very erratic, wide wobbling bait. So even if you get a little sedimentation on your line, it still runs very aggressively and it's able to clean a lot of that. And if I have a clean bottom, I'm going to be using this to deflect around off the bottom and create that good smoke cloud that draws the fish to it. But I've had really good luck with the money badger fishing around the algae blooms. And then the last one is a fluke style bait, just slowly working again, very similar to the same areas I'd be working those moving baits. I'm just going to be twitching it right below the LJ line. So maybe it darts up and in it and then darts down out of it. Just a really good bait. I find that a lot of times those fish are really keying in on bait fish that are right at those levels. And I just happen to think it's more so due to the fact that the fish have something to use as an ambush. They can kind of get blended in. They can kind of get inside of that LJ bloom if they need to, or they can run right below it. And they just use it like a shadow. They use it as a mud line. They use it as something that gives them an advantage to capture bait fish. But these are my favorite baits. I have found that pretty much no matter where I'm at, if there's a big algae bloom going on, I can catch them on these baits. So let me know in the comment section, what are some of your favorite baits when you've got a bunch of green sludge floating through the water column? I'd love to hear from you if you have special baits that you think work well under those circumstances. Otherwise, if you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, we'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.